Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and I know that I've talked a lot about free agency in this offseason and some of the moves that were made, whether it be risky signings or smart signings or anything in between. But I think it's also important to talk about what this free agency and this offseason meant and means for the league moving forward, because I think this has been one that's been pretty impactful and will be one that we look back on in a couple of years and say, hey, this may have been a turning point in how players, specifically in this case, treat free agency and what teams are willing to adjust and focus on to try and attract big name free agents. So let's go ahead and get started. So for the longest time, free agency has primarily been focused on teams like the Lakers and the Knicks that are in big markets that have a lot of prestige as franchises and that are attractive to other players to come and play for them because they just want to play for that franchise, because they want to be a Laker, because they want to be a Knick, because they want to play in the Staples Center, because they want to play in Madison Square Garden. And for the longest time, that's what we thought was the big attraction. And then even in other circumstances, like with the Miami Heat Big Three, it's always been about the franchise and about the location. And maybe this offseason that's starting to change. Because what ended up happening was we saw two kind of little guys in those big cities, being New York and Los Angeles, end up getting some of the bigger free agency hauls of the offseason. And that obviously being the Clippers bringing in Kawhi Leonard and then trading for Paul George, and then the Nets bringing in Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. And that's extremely significant because those are the two quote unquote little brothers of those cities that were still able to outfight the big brothers for free agents in this particular offseason. And what that tells me is maybe these players are starting to pay a lot more attention to things other than just prestige and cap space when considering their free agency decisions, because we saw two other big free agents, that being Jimmy Butler and D'Angelo Russell, get signed and traded to teams that didn't even have cap space, that being the Heat and the Warriors, rather than signing with those bigger teams, those more prestigious teams that had the outright cap space to sign them, in the Knicks and the Lakers. And this is a message by some of the biggest names in the NBA player-wise, that just having cap space and being a prestigious franchise isn't enough anymore to be a big-time free agency destination. And one of the more important factors now, as Kyrie Irving put it, is the infrastructure of the team that they end up going to. Now, his comments were a little bit strange simply because he said that the Nets infrastructure was what attracted him so much to the team when he was leaving a team in Boston that had plenty of talent around him and a good coaching staff and a good front office. But the point still remains that in a vacuum, you want to go to a team that knows what they're doing, that isn't dysfunctional, that has a good relationship between the front office and the coaching staff and the players, and has building blocks around you. It's not enough anymore to just say, hey, we have cap space, but we don't have anybody else. Just bring another star with you and we'll roll from there. Players are realizing that if a team actually knows what they're doing, they're going to have other players there and ready to put around them when they decide to sign and potentially bring another free agent with them, rather than just completely clearing the roster. For example, if it was just a head-to-head and everything else was even, I'm not really sure that Kyrie would have chosen Brooklyn over New York or really any of the other teams that would have been interested in signing him if the Nets didn't already have a good amount of players there that he could see himself playing with. And then also Kevin Durant obviously made the same decision as well. And a similar situation for the Clippers, because we saw Kawhi Leonard and by extension Paul George turn down the opportunity to play in LA as a part of a huge big three with LeBron James and then Anthony Davis, at least in Kawhi's case specifically. And instead he chose to go somewhere that had complementary options around him. And part of that is just because Kawhi wasn't interested in this huge super team idea and he'd rather play against LeBron than play with him. But it also had to factor in that these are players that work well with stars rather than just bringing in a whole bunch of stars to play around each other. And this is definitely different than what we've seen in the past. And I think it's a result of players being smarter and thinking more about the teams that they're going to as organizations rather than just as franchises, because they're counting on these teams to continue to further their career, and that's not something to be taken lightly. And it's also because there's so much more networking going on now between all of the players across the NBA, most specifically the star players. These guys all talk, especially if they're on the same Olympic team or they participate in some Team USA stuff. A lot of these guys are in communication with each other a good amount of the time during the season. So if one team gets a bad rap or a player has a bad experience with a team, it's going to have a huge negative impact depending on who they're friends with and who they talk to and who that team is going to try and bring in free agency. For example, one of the other players that the Nets brought in free agency this offseason, in addition to Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, and one of their good friends, was DeAndre Jordan, who spent some time with the Knicks last season after being traded midseason from the Mavs. And I don't know this for a fact, but if DeAndre Jordan did have a bad experience with the Knicks, or maybe saw some things that he didn't like, or just didn't get a great vibe about New York, I'm sure that he told Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving that in their free agency decision-making process, and that could have been what continued to push them towards Brooklyn. So it's important now more than ever to have a good impression on every single player that comes through your organization, because you never know who they're friends with, you never know who they're going to talk to, and you never know how it could affect either positively or negatively your potential free agency options a year or two or three from that point in time. And so circling back to my original point, you can't just have cap space and prestige anymore. Like, it's just not enough to attract these big name free agents. You have to have other players around them that they can see themselves playing with. You have to have a stable front office and coaching staff. And this isn't, this doesn't work for everybody. Like, I don't believe that the Memphis Grizzlies, for example, could have this great infrastructure and sign 2 max level free agents in the same offseason, because prestige does still matter. Location definitely still matters, especially as more and more of these guys are more and more focused on outside of basketball ventures rather than just basketball all the time. So this isn't like an across the board thing where if every team in the league followed this new set of criteria, they would suddenly become a big free agency destination, because there is just still some inherent advantages to certain teams being where they are. But the point is, that's not the end-all be-all anymore. You can't just bring in free agents anymore because you're a prestigious franchise, because you have the cap space. A lot of other stuff matters now, most specifically the infrastructure that Kyrie Irving mentioned. Now, it's possible that maybe this is a bit of an overreaction and it's just, kind of a blip on the radar of this particular offseason, where the Clippers and the Nets were both able to make big moves in free agency over, their bigger brothers in their respective cities, because the Lakers did just land LeBron last year in 2018. But even then, I think part of what attracted LeBron to LA was the fact that they did have some pieces around him with Brandon Ingram and Lonzo Ball, Josh Hart, Kyle Kuzma. Even though obviously he also saw them as trade pieces eventually, it's still important to see that kind of infrastructure. And then conversely, the Lakers had plenty of issues and had articles come about some of their dysfunction over the past year or so, right before this year's free agency. So certainly things didn't look as good for them going into this offseason. And maybe that's one of the things that prevented them from getting someone like Kawhi Leonard in the first place. So even though one of the big brothers got a huge free agency addition last offseason, the circumstances are different, and it still kind of goes to prove my point about the infrastructure being so critical and the opinion of players, or the players' opinions of your team and your franchise being so critical as well. Now, again, who knows if this actually ends up being this big turning point moment that I think it will be, because we've kind of seen some stuff like this in the past. A couple years ago, when Greg Monroe decided to sign with the Milwaukee Bucks in free agency, or obviously a smaller market team, people thought that was a huge deal because he decided to choose a team that, wasn't the Knicks, it wasn't the Lakers, and maybe this would change how free agency was looked at. And it did a little bit, but Monroe never had any success in Milwaukee. And really the reason that other teams are starting to get bigger free agents now is just because there's more money and because teams are getting smarter. So you never really know, right? But this is just something to look at, something to pay attention to. And maybe a couple years from now, people look back at this video and say, yeah, I mean, that's definitely a consideration to think about, that this offseason was one in which players are really starting to realize how important that infrastructure is. And it's not just about cap space and prestige, but also these two things have to work out. Like the Clippers and Nets have to end up being good, have to treat these respective free agents well. They have to have a positive reaction to being with the Clippers and with the Nets. Otherwise, all of this is completely reversed. If they don't get a positive impression from this experience, then that's going to kind of completely reverse everything that I was talking about in this video. But as long as everything goes well, maybe this is something that we'll continue to see, where free agency is a bit more wide open and players are attracted more to teams and organizations that just know what they're doing, have the infrastructure, rather than just a ton of money and a name on the jersey that they want to play for. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.